The ostler took one look at the plain gray traveling cloak, the single corded trunk, and the lady sitting alone with no man to speak for her, and he gave her room to the gentleman who came after. It was done so smoothly that Cassandra Vane very nearly missed the moment of being robbed. One instant she had been promised the last private parlor at the Bell and Hart. She had heard the word "yours" from the landlord's own mouth, had pressed her last half-crown into his palm to hold it. And the next a post-chaise had clattered into the yard, streaming rain and lamplight, 4 matched greys and a crest on the door, and the landlord had crossed the floor to it the way a needle crosses to a lodestone, and the parlor she had paid for had become, in the space of a courtesy, somebody else's. She was 24, the orphan daughter of a Hampshire schoolmaster who had died, leaving her nothing but a good hand, a better mind, and a name that opened no doors. She was traveling north in the worst storm of the autumn to take up a post as governess to a banker's 3 daughters in York, the post in Bath having ended when the eldest son began to look at her in a way that made the mistress of the house look at her too, and a governess who is looked at is a governess who is dismissed, fairly or not. She had learned a great deal in 6 years of being the most educated person in a house, and the least regarded. She had learned, above all, not to flinch first. The surest way to be made small, she had found, was to act as though you expected it. So she did not weep, and she did not argue with the landlord, who would not have heard her over the new arrivals in any case. She simply gathered her reticule and her one good book and removed herself to the public tap-room, where the fire was poor, and the benches were crowded with carters and a wet drover and a peddler asleep over his pack. And she found a corner of bench near the cold end of the room, and she sat with her back very straight, and she waited for a storm that showed no sign of ending to end. It is worth saying what she had, because it was not much. She had the gray cloak, good wool gone thin at the cuffs. She had the corded trunk with 3 gowns in it and her dead mother's testament and the letter of engagement from the bank in York, signed and sealed, which was the most valuable thing she owned because it was a year's bread. She had 4 shillings and the change from the half-crown she would now have to fight to recover, and she had, drawn over her hands against the cold of the public room, a pair of kid gloves the color of weak tea, the left one whole and the right one mended, the seam along the thumb split and darned with a silk so carefully matched that you had to know to look for it. They had been her mother's. They were the last soft thing in her life that had belonged to someone who had loved her, and she had mended the torn one herself by candlelight rather than let it go, and she kept the mended hand turned a little inward out of habit, as a person keeps a healed thing from being knocked. She was studying the mended seam, in fact, turning her right hand to the firelight to see whether the darn was beginning to fray again, when a voice nearby said without preamble, "You have lost your parlor." Cassandra looked up. A man had taken the settle across the narrow trestle from her, a man she had not heard arrive over the rain, and her first thought, formed in the cool, quick way she had of measuring a room, was that he did not belong in the tap-room either. He was perhaps 33, tall, with a strong jaw and dark hair worn unfashionably short and tousled, and dark eyes that in the firelight looked almost black. A straight nose, a face the candle made warm, the kind of face that is called handsome, and then, on a second look, is called something better than handsome, because the second look finds that it is kind. He wore a plain, dark riding coat, well cut but travel-worn, no rings, no fobs, nothing that announced him. A land agent, she decided, or a man of business riding ahead of his employer's chaise. He had the steady, unhurried manner of a man who is used to being listened to and has never had to raise his voice about it. "I have lost nothing that was truly mine," she said. "I had only borrowed it for the evening, and it has been recalled. One ought not to weep over a loan." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the place a smile comes from. That is a remarkably philosophical view of being turned out into a tap-room in a gale. "It is the only view that allows one to keep one's dignity in a tap-room in a gale," she said. "And dignity, sir, is the one thing in this room that nobody can give to a duke that they have not first left to a governess. So I shall keep mine, if it is all the same to you, and watched the fire. "You are a governess, then?" "I am traveling to become one. Whether I succeed will depend in part on whether the mail coach runs in the morning, which depends in part on whether God means this rain to stop, about which I have no information and He has not consulted me." She turned her hand back from the firelight. "You will forgive me. I am not used to being addressed by strangers in public houses, and I find I am too tired to be charming about it. I have had a long day, and it appears I am to have a long and upright night on this excellent bench." She expected him to take the dismissal and go. Men did. A plain woman alone who answers back is not interesting to most men for very long. She becomes quickly a thing to be left to her corner. But the man across the trestle did not go. He sat a moment longer looking at her with an expression she could not read, not pity, which she would have refused, and not the warm, presumptuous interest she had fled Bath to escape, but something quieter and more attentive, as though she had said something he was turning over. Then he rose, said, "Forgive the intrusion," in a voice that meant it, and went out into the passage. She thought that was the end of it. She was glad of it. She drew the gray cloak closer and bent her mind toward the long, cold hours and tried not to think of the warm parlor with the good fire that was now full of strangers, with a crest on their door. And she had nearly succeeded in not thinking of it when the landlord himself came hurrying into the tap-room, red-faced and full of apology, to tell her that there had been a mistake, that the private parlor was hers after all, that her trunk had already been carried up, and would she be so good as to come this way? Cassandra did not move at once. She had learned to be suspicious of a sudden change in her fortunes, because in her experience a sudden change in a poor woman's fortunes is usually a trap with better manners. "There has been no mistake," she said. "I was turned out not an hour ago to make room for a gentleman's party, and very correctly, since the gentleman could pay for what I could only afford. I am content here. I have no wish to be turned out a second time when the next chaise arrives, and made a fool of twice in one evening for the entertainment of the room. No, miss, and no, you mistake it." The landlord twisted his apron. "The gentlemen, that is, the party that took the parlor, they have given it up. Given it up to you, miss, with their compliments, and taken the small rooms over the stable for themselves, and the parlor is paid through to morning, and there's a supper laid, and a fire built up, and I'm to say nothing more than that a debt is owed to anyone who keeps her dignity in a tap-room in a gale, and that the debt is theirs and not yours." He looked thoroughly bewildered by his own message. "Those were the words I was to say, miss. I don't pretend to understand them." But Cassandra understood them. She sat very still on the bench at the cold end of the public room, with her mended glove turned in toward her palm, and she understood exactly who had sent that message and what he had given up to send it. And for the first time that long, bruising day, she felt something behind her eyes that was not the held-back salt of self-pity, but a quite different and far more dangerous warmth. And she had to look hard at the poor fire for a moment before she trusted herself to stand. She went up. The parlor was small and low-beamed and golden, a good fire snapping in the grate, the table laid with cold fowl and bread, and a dish of stewed apples and a pot of chocolate, and her own corded trunk standing in the corner like a thing come home. There was no one in it. He had not stayed to be thanked. She stood in the doorway a long moment, and then she crossed to the fire and held her cold hands out to it, the whole one and the mended one both. And she found she was not quite able to be philosophical after all. She did not eat at once. She sat in the good chair by the fire and looked at the supper laid for her, and she thought about the shape of the thing that had been done. It was easy to be kind with money. She had seen a great deal of that over 6 years, the careless charity of comfortable people who tossed a coin and felt warm about themselves for an hour. This was not that. To give up a parlor on a streaming night was nothing. A man with a crest on his chaise could buy himself another comfort with a snap of his fingers. But he had not stayed. That was the part she turned over with her cold hands held to the flame. A man who gives in order to be thanked stays to be thanked. It is the thanks he is buying. This one had built the fire and laid the supper and gone out into the rain to the cold rooms over the stable so that the gift should cost her nothing, not even the burden of gratitude, not even a stranger watching her be grateful. She had not known there was a kind of giving so careful of the receiver that it took pains to make itself invisible. It was the rarest thing she had ever been handed, and the most frightening, because a woman armored against cruelty and against condescension has no armor at all against being treated, by a stranger, exactly as well as she had always privately believed she deserved. She did not see him again that night, but in the morning, when the rain had thinned to a gray drizzle, and the yard was a churn of mud, and the mail coach stood waiting with its team stamping, she came down with her trunk corded and her cloak fastened, and she found the inn full of the bustle of the titled party preparing to depart north as well, a fretful older lady in puce traveling silk, a sharp-faced younger one, 2 maids, a courier, and holding the door of the crested chaise with the unhurried steadiness she already knew, the dark-coated man from the tap-room. So he was their man of business after all. She had been right. And she found, crossing the muddy yard toward the mail coach, that she was foolishly sorry to have been right, that she had half hoped, against all sense, that he was something more freestanding than a hired man at a great lady's beck. But a debt is a debt, and she did not mean to leave it unpaid in feeling, even if she could never pay it in coin. She altered her course 3 steps and went up to him, where he stood at the chaise door, and she put out her hand, the left, the whole one. And she said plainly, "I know it was you. The parlor. I will not embarrass us both by making a scene of it, but I will not be such a coward as to drive off pretending I did not know. Thank you. It was a great kindness and a costly one, and I shall not forget it." He took her offered hand, and for a moment he did not let go, and he looked down at her other hand, the right one, where it held the strap of her reticule. He looked at the mended thumb, the darn so carefully matched that you had to know to look. Something crossed his face that she could not name, a kind of arrest, as if he had seen a ghost and was too well bred to say so. Then it was gone, and he said only, "You owe me nothing. A man who keeps a warm room for himself while a woman of more breeding than half this party freezes in the public tap-room is not a gentleman, whatever his rank. I did nothing but decline to be that man." A pause. "Where do you travel?" "To York, to 3 young ladies who do not yet know they are to learn Latin whether they like it or not." "York," he said, as though the word meant something to him. "We are for the north as well. The roads after Grantham are bad in this wet. The Trisby Ford will be up, and the coach may be held a day at the Angel. If it is—" He stopped. He seemed to consider something, and to decide against it, and then to decide for it after all. "If it is, the party I serve breaks the journey at a house near there, Aldermere. You would be made welcome and dry, and there is a library that would shame the bankers in York, and you would owe no one anything for it, should the Ford stop you. I only mention it." It was on the edge of her tongue to say that a governess does not break her journey at the country houses of strangers, that it was precisely the kind of irregular kindness that ends with a poor woman's character in tatters. But the fretful lady in puce called from the chaise in a voice like a struck bell, "Aldermere, are you to stand in the mud all morning? We shall lose the light." And he turned his head to answer her, and the moment closed. Cassandra climbed into the crowded mail coach with her trunk lashed behind, and the team lurched forward through the mud, and she watched the crested chaise and the dark-coated man dwindle and vanish behind the gray curtain of the rain, and she told herself that was the end of it, the whole of it, a kindness given and a kindness thanked, and that she would not think of him again. She thought of him for 40 miles. She told herself it was the gloves. He had looked at her mother's mended glove as a man looks at a thing he recognizes, and she could not account for it. And a mind starved of puzzles will worry at any puzzle it is given. She turned her hand to the gray light of the coach window and studied the darn, the silk so carefully matched, and tried to remember her mother's hands in the gloves, and could not quite, because her mother had died when Cassandra was 11, and the memories had worn pale at the corners the way the leather had, and that thought put a tightness in her throat that had nothing to do with any dark-eyed man at all, and she made herself stop, and she opened her book, and she read the same paragraph 9 times and understood none of it. The Trisby ford was up. They came down to it in the failing light of the second day, the brown water sheeting fast and high over the stones, a carter's wagon stranded on the far bank, the coachman swearing in a tired, flat way that meant he had expected exactly this. There was nothing to be done. The water would not fall before morning at the soonest, and the nearest shelter was the Angel at Grantham, 3 miles back, and the coach turned in the narrow road with a great labor of horses, and came at last, full dark and streaming, into the yard of an inn that was already crammed to the rafters with everyone else. The flooded roads had stranded. There was no room. There was, the harassed landlady said, not a bed, nor a bench, nor a clean corner of stable to be had in Grantham that night, the floods having driven half the county into the town, and she was sorry, and she could spare them tea and a place by the kitchen fire turn and turn about, and that was the whole of her charity because it was the whole of what she had. Cassandra took her turn at the kitchen fire with the other stranded travelers and drank weak tea, and thought, with a grim humor she was rather proud of, that she had now been turned out of 2 private parlors and would round off the set by sleeping upright in a strange kitchen, and that her life had a certain symmetry to it, even if it had nothing else. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the message came. A footman in plain dark livery, she did not yet know to be surprised by how plain, found her at the kitchen fire and bowed and said that the party at Aldermere had heard the Grantham road was stopped and the inns full, and that the house was but 2 miles off, and that there was a fire and a supper and a chambermaid ready, and that she was begged to come, with no obligation of any kind, as one stranded traveler offering shelter to another. And when she began wearily to refuse, for all the old reasons, the reasons that protect a poor woman and cost her every kindness, the footman added, as if it had been pressed on him to say that there were 2 elderly gentlewomen of the household who would be glad of her company, and a housekeeper of 40 years' good character, and that no lady's name was ever the worse for a night under the roof of the dowager's own wing, where no gentleman set foot. It was very carefully done. Every objection she could raise had been answered before she raised it, the chaperonage, the propriety, the obligation, and answered not by a great man's careless command, but by someone who had thought, with real attention, about exactly what a woman in her position would fear, and had taken pains to make those fears groundless. And she was so tired, and it was so cold, and somewhere under the tiredness and the cold was the thing she would not name, the wish to be once more in a low golden room with a good fire that a kind man had given up for her. And so against every rule she had governed her life by, Cassandra Vane gathered her trunk and her reticule and her mother's gloves, and she went out into the rain to the carriage that waited, and she let herself be carried to Aldermere. She would say in later years that she knew the house was no land agent's the moment the gates opened. The avenue went on too long, the lights were too many. The pile that rose at the end of it against the wet black sky was no manor but something nearer a palace, a great Palladian front with a score of windows lit gold, and a portico a coach could turn under, and she sat in the dark of the carriage with her hands very still in her lap, and felt the careful structure of her assumptions come quietly apart. A man of business does not live here. A man of business does not give such a house's best parlor to a governess at an inn. She had been so certain she had measured him. She had prided herself on it. And she had been, she now saw, entirely and completely wrong, and she did not yet know in which direction. She was met not by him, but by exactly the people the footman had promised. A stout, kind housekeeper with a candle, 2 elderly gentlewomen in caps who fell on the arrival of a fresh young face with the delight of women who have outlived most of their company, and a fire and a supper and a chamber hung in faded rose with a bed she could have wept into. No gentleman appeared. The dowager's wing, the housekeeper explained, was the oldest and warmest part of the house, kept just so since the late Duchess's time, and his grace never came into it, out of respect for his mother's memory. The young miss might be as easy here as in her own home. Cassandra noted the words, his grace, and the late Duchess, and the young master who was now the Duke, and she fitted them together in the dark after the candle was out, and she understood finally with a hot wave of mortification exactly who had been turned out of his parlor at the Bell and Heart for her, and exactly whose hand she had shaken in the mud and called a man of business, and she lay in the rose-hung bed with her face in her hands and did not know whether to laugh or be sick. He was the Duke of Aldermere. He had been the Duke of Aldermere the whole time. He had let her lecture him about dignity in a tap room, had sat on a settle in a public house, and let her tell him that nobody could give a duke a dignity they had not left to a governess, and he had not corrected her, had given up his fire and his bed, and ridden ahead to make a frightened poor woman comfortable, and had asked for nothing, and had even arranged with the most delicate care for there to be elderly ladies and a 40-year housekeeper, so that her good name should take no hurt. And she had thanked him as one thanks a servant for a master's bounty. The mortification of it kept her awake an hour. And then, slowly, under the mortification, came the other thing, the more dangerous thing, the understanding of what kind of man troubles himself so for a woman who can do nothing for him and does not even know who he is. And that understanding was warm, and it frightened her far more than the embarrassment had. Before she slept, she did the thing she had done every night of her life, the thing her father taught her when she was small and frightened, and the world was already too large. She knelt at the side of the strange warm bed and prayed, and she noticed, kneeling, that she did not pray for herself at all, not for the post in York to hold, nor for the floods to fall, nor for her own 4 shillings to stretch. She prayed instead for the drover she had left asleep over his pack in the cold tap-room, who had no duke to give him a parlor, and for the river family sleeping in the duke's barns, that the water would spare what little they had, and last, almost shyly, for the dark-eyed man who had given up his fire and asked for nothing, that whatever grief had hollowed him so quietly might one day be eased. She did not know that the man she prayed for had come down the dark house for a book, and paused in the passage, and had heard a low voice through a half-shut door asking nothing for itself and everything for everyone else, and had gone away again without his book, more shaken than he would have cared to own. She only knew that she rose from her knees lighter than she had knelt, and slept. She meant to be gone before he rose. It was the only dignified course. A governess does not breakfast with a duke. She sends down her thanks and slips away to the mended road and is forgotten, which is the natural and proper end of such an accident. She was up before light, dressed, her trunk corded, her gloves drawn on, and she came down the great cold stairs in the gray dawn, meaning to ask the housekeeper to call the carriage. And she found the Duke of Aldermere already up, alone, in the library, in his shirt-sleeves with a fire he had built himself, and a book open on his knee, and he looked up at her in the doorway and did not pretend, this time, to be anyone but who he was. "You know," he said. It was not a question. "I know." She stood very straight in the doorway with her trunk cord still in her hand. "Your Grace, I have been a great fool and a great deal of trouble, and I will be neither a moment longer. I came down to call the carriage. I thank you for your roof and your fire and your most careful kindness, and I am ashamed to my bones that I lectured a duke about dignity in a tap room, and I should like to go before I do anything worse." "Sit down," he said, "and have your chocolate, and do not be ashamed, because it is the best thing anyone has said to me in a year." He set the book aside. "Do you know what it is to be a duke, Miss Vane? It is to go through the whole of your life never once hearing the truth from anyone, because the truth is inconvenient to people who want things from you, and there is always something they want. The landlord wanted my custom. The lady in Puce, my aunt, wants me married to her niece, who wants my house. Every person I met for 30 years has wanted something and shaped what they said to me around the getting of it. And then I sat down in a tap room across from a tired woman who took me for a man of business and who wanted nothing from me at all, and who told me to my face that I might be a duke, but I had better leave a governess her dignity, since it was the only thing in the room I couldn't buy. Do you understand that I came up those stairs that night and gave you my parlor not out of charity but out of pure selfishness, because you were the first true thing I had heard since my mother died, and I could not bear to put you back out in the rain?" He stopped, as if surprised by his own speech. "Sit down, please. You are not in any kind of trouble. You are the opposite of trouble. Sit down and tell me about Latin and the 3 young ladies, and let me give you a breakfast before the Ford goes down, and I give you my word as the dull, dependable man of business you took me for, that you may leave the moment you wish to, and I will never trouble you again." So she sat, and she drank her chocolate, and the fire he had built himself snapped in the grate, and the gray dawn came up gold in the long library windows, and they talked, first stiffly, then less so, and then in the unguarded running way of 2 people who have unexpectedly found the rarest thing, which is someone to whom they need not perform. She told him about her father, the schoolmaster, who had taught her Greek because there was no one else to teach, and she was the child to hand, and who had died of a fever in a poor parish, leaving her a good mind and no portion. He told her about his mother, the late Duchess, who had married up out of a vicarage, and never lost the vicarage in her, and who had spent the last years of her life looking for someone, he did not say who, and had died with the looking unfinished. And all the while the thing she could not name sat warm and quiet between them, and she was careful of it, and so was he, and neither of them touched it, because both of them knew exactly how easily a thing so new is broken. The library itself worked on her like a slow warmth. She had imagined, on the rare occasions she let herself imagine such rooms, that the libraries of dukes would be cold showpieces, the books bought by the yard and never opened, gilt spines standing to attention for guests who could not read the Latin on them. This was not that either. The books were used. They were shelved by no system but the affectionate disorder of a reader who knew where each one was, and there was a worn place on the floor, before one shelf where a man had plainly stood 1,000 times, reaching for the same companions. She walked the shelves while the chocolate cooled, and found Greek she knew and Greek she did not, and a bay of sermons gone soft with handling, and a child's primer, much battered, kept among the great folios as though someone could not bear to put it away. "My mother's," the Duke said, watching her hand pause on it. "She taught herself her letters out of it, in the vicarage, before she was anybody. She kept it here to remind herself, she said, that the grand books and the small one were only the same thing at different ages." Cassandra did not say that she had taught 3 sets of children their letters out of one very like it, and had thought of her own father every time. She only put it back exactly where it had been, and the Duke watched her do it, and something in his face settled. It was the Ford that kept her in the end, though she was honest enough with herself to know that she was glad of the Ford. The brown water did not fall that day, nor the next. The rain came again in the night and put the whole low country under sheets of standing water, and the road north was simply gone, and the Angel at Grantham and every other inn in 20 miles was as full as before, and there was nowhere for a stranded governess to go but the rose-hung room in the dowager's wing, where the 2 elderly ladies adopted her outright, and the housekeeper fed her up, and the household, with the strange, swift tenderness of a place that has been short of young life, made her welcome. 3 days became a week. She wrote to the bank in York explaining the floods, and had back a stiff but not unkind note granting her grace until the roads cleared, and she settled, against every intention, into the rhythm of the great warm house, mornings in the library with the Duke, who turned out to be the best read man she had ever spoken to, and the only one who did not seem to mind that she was better read than he in 3 subjects: afternoons with the old ladies and their endless gentle reminiscence, evenings by a fire that no one took away from her. She learned the house in pieces across that week, and each piece corrected something she had assumed. She had thought a Duke's days must be idle. His were not. He was up before any of them and out, whatever the weather, walking his flooded land in oilskins to see which of his tenants the water had put out and what was wanted. And she gathered, from the housekeeper rather than from him, for he never spoke of it, that the families whose cottages stood low by the river were sleeping dry that week in his own barns, at his own word, that the steward had been told to forgive the quarter's rent to any man whose ground was under water, and that none of this was charity in his own telling, but merely, as he put it once when she pressed him, the rent he paid for the luck of being born to dry ground when other men were not. She had thought, too, that the great cold house must be a lonely place to keep, and she found it was, that for all its lit windows the Duke had been, in every way that signified, as alone in it as she had been alone in her corner of other people's houses, his mother dead, and his father long dead, and the only blood relation who troubled to visit being the aunt in Puce, who came to press her niece on him and went away cross when he would not be pressed. They were, she understood by the third day, two solitudes that had each privately concluded that solitude was the safest arrangement on offer, and had each been quietly, unanswerably contradicted by the other across a trestle table in a tap-room in the rain. There was one evening that week she kept apart in her memory from the rest. The old ladies had gone up early, the housekeeper had banked the fires, and Cassandra, unable to sleep in so much unaccustomed warmth, had come down to return a book and found the Duke there before her, and they had not talked of anything in particular, had only sat, each with a volume, on either side of the great hearth, in a silence so easy and so complete that she startled herself by realizing, after the better part of an hour, that she had not once felt the old watchful need to fill it, to perform her usefulness, to earn her place by being clever or quiet or convenient. She had simply been allowed to sit, and she had looked up from her page at the man across the fire reading his own, his strong profile gold in the light, his lips moving slightly over some line that had caught him as her father's used to, and the dangerous warm thing had risen so high in her that she had had to look down and read a sentence 3 times. And she had thought, with a clarity that frightened her, I could live my whole life in this silence and want for nothing. And then she had thought of all the reasons she could not, and closed the book and bid him a steady good night, and gone up and lain awake a long time listening to the rain. And it was the old ladies in the end who undid the last of it, who took the careful structure she and the Duke had built of not naming the thing, and pulled, without in the least meaning to, the one thread that brought the whole concealed history down. It happened over needlework. The elder of the 2 old ladies, Miss Honoria, who had been companion to the late Duchess for 30 years and had a memory like a parish register, noticed Cassandra mending the thumb of her right glove by the window one gray afternoon, the silk carefully matched, the darn so neat you had to know to look. And Miss Honoria went very still and set down her own work and asked in a voice gone suddenly thin where the young miss had come by those gloves. They were my mother's, Cassandra said, not looking up, drawing the silk through. The only thing of hers I have. She died when I was 11. I mended the thumb myself last winter rather than give them up. She held the glove to the light. Foolish, perhaps. But one keeps what one can of the people one has lost. Your mother, said Miss Honoria, and there was something in her voice now that made Cassandra look up at last. The old lady's eyes were fixed on the gloves as though they were a face risen from the grave. Child, what was your mother's name? Her name before she married your father. What was her maiden name? Leinster, Cassandra said, puzzled. Anne Leinster. She was a clergyman's daughter from Kent. Why do you— But Miss Honoria had risen with a cry, both hands pressed to her mouth, and had crossed the room faster than her old legs should have carried her, and had taken the glove out of Cassandra's startled hands and turned it inside out, to the seam, and there, stitched small inside the cuff in thread gone brown with age, where Cassandra had looked 100 times and never thought to wonder at it, were 3 letters that were not her mother's. A.M.C. And Miss Honoria looked from the letters to Cassandra's face, the gray-green eyes, the set of the brow, and she said in a whisper, These were not your mother's gloves, my dear. Or, they were given to your mother. These were the Duchess's. Anne Maria Constance, her own girlhood gloves. I was by her when she had them made. She sat down heavily, gripping Cassandra's hand. She gave a pair to one girl only in all her life, to a young woman she loved like a daughter and lost, a clergyman's bride she had befriended in her vicarage years, and then, through some quarrel of families, was kept from. She searched the last 10 years of her life for that girl and the child she'd heard she had. She died not finding her. The old lady's eyes ran over. Anne Lenister. Anne. Oh, my dear. Oh, you have your grandmother's brow, exactly. She looked for you. The whole of the looking she could not finish. It was for you. Cassandra sat with her hand caught in the old woman's 2 hands, and the mended glove between them, and the gray afternoon light on the seam, and the floor of her certainties, which had already given way once that week, gave way again entirely, not into fear this time, but into something vast and quiet, and almost too large to feel, the understanding that the soft, worn thing she had kept against her heart all these years, the last gift of a mother she could barely remember, had been the Duchess's own, that she had not been alone and unwanted in the world after all, that somewhere a great kind lady had loved her mother and looked for her, year on year, and died with the looking undone. She did not weep. She found she was past weeping. She only turned the glove in her hand and looked at the 3 small letters she had never read and said, in a voice she did not quite recognize, "She looked for me." And the Duke, who had come to the library door unheard, and who had stood through the last of it with his hand on the frame and his face gone pale and strange, said quietly from the doorway, "She did, to the end. I sat with her. There was a girl she could not find and a debt she could not pay, and it grieved her past everything. She made me promise I would keep looking." He came into the room slowly, his dark eyes never leaving Cassandra's face, as though he were rereading every hour of the past week in the light of this. "I have wondered all this week why your glove stopped my heart in the inn-yard. I knew the work of that darn. My mother taught the woman who taught the maid who mended this house's linen for 40 years that exact small backstitch that turned thumb. I saw it on your hand in the mud at the Bell and Heart, and I could not have told you why it undid me. Now I can." His voice was not quite steady. "You are the girl my mother looked for. You came in off the floods to the one house in England that has been waiting for you, and you did not know, and neither did I. And we have spent a week pretending not to feel a thing that—" He stopped. He did not finish it. He did not need to. There was, of course, more than wonder in it. There is always more than wonder in such things, and Cassandra, who had been poor and watchful all her life, came to the harder part of it before he did, came to it that same night, alone in the rose-hung room, turning the glove and the 3 small letters over and over, because if she was who Miss Honoria said she was, the granddaughter by love if not by blood of the late Duchess, then there was the matter of the Duchess's will, which the old lady, weeping, had let fall, that her Grace had set aside a portion for the lost girl should she ever be found, a sum and a small property in Kent, named and sealed and lodged with the family's man of law against the day, and that the day had never come, and the portion had lain these 4 years unclaimed, and the aunt in Puce, Lady Sefton, the Duke's father's sister who had managed the dead Duchess's affairs in the confusion after her death, had been heard to say more than once that the lost girl was a fancy of a dying woman's failing mind, and that the money was better folded back into the estate where it belonged. And Cassandra lay in the dark and understood that she had walked off a flooded road into a fortune that someone had spent 4 years quietly deciding she would never come to claim. She might have claimed it the easy way. She might have let the Duke do it. He would have gladly, in an afternoon, with a word to his lawyer and a colder word to his aunt, and have taken the portion and the property and the place at the great house's heart that everyone in it plainly longed to give her, and have let herself be lifted by his hand out of governessing and poverty and watchfulness forever. It would have been so easy. And it was, she found, the one thing she could not do. Because to take it as a rescue would have been to be at the last exactly the thing she had spent her life refusing to be. A woman lifted, a woman owing, a woman whose dignity was a gift in a great man's keeping rather than a thing of her own. She had told him in the tap room that dignity was the one thing nobody could give her that they had not first left her. She had meant it, and she found, in the rose-hung room with the glove in her hands, that she meant it still, and that it was about to cost her everything she had begun, against all her rules, to want. She came down in the morning corded and cloaked, the floods fallen at last, the road north open, and she found the Duke in the library, and she did not sit. "The ford is down," she said. "The mail runs at noon. I am going to York, your Grace, to the 3 young ladies and the Latin, as I set out to do." He rose. She watched it land on him. "Cassandra, you cannot mean to—" "I do mean to." Her voice was steady because she had spent the night making it steady. "Hear me, because I shall only manage to say it once. I know what your aunt did, or means to do, with the portion your mother left. Miss Honoria told me all of it. And I could stay, and let you set it right, and let you give me back what was always meant to be mine, and let you give me the rest of it, the thing neither of us has said, and I will not. Not because I do not—" She stopped. She would not lie, even now. "Not because I do not feel it, but because if I take it from your hand, then for the whole of my life I shall be the governess the Duke of Aldermere rescued off a flooded road, the poor relation he lifted up, the woman who came with nothing and was given everything, and I would rather go on being nobody on my own feet than be somebody in your debt. I told you in the tap room, dignity is the one thing you cannot give me that you have not first left me. I find I meant it more than I knew. So I am going to York. I am going to take the post and earn my own bread and write to your mother's man of law myself, in my own name, and claim what is mine because it is mine, and not because a duke was kind to me. And when I have done that, when I am a woman with her own 4 shillings and her own roof and her own name, owing no living soul, then, your Grace, if you should still wish to say the thing you did not say, you may come and find me and say it to my equal." She drew the mended glove on over her right hand, slowly, deliberately, the 3 small letters hidden against her palm. "Not to a rescue. I will not be a rescue." And she put out her hand, the right this time, the mended one, the Duchess's own. And he took it, and she felt him feel the darn through the kid, and she said, "Thank you for my dignity, your Grace. It was the one thing you left me. It turns out it was everything." And she went out and got into the noon mail and was carried north through a washed, bright country and did not look back, though it cost her more than the leaving of any warm room ever had. Lady Sefton learned the price of folding away other people's portions. She did not learn it from a scene. There was no scene. There was only some weeks later a quiet letter from the family's man of law, requiring her to render an account of the late Duchess's bequests. All of them, in particular a certain sealed portion set aside for one Anne Lenister or her issue. A claim having now been entered in due and proper form by a Miss Cassandra Vane of York, Governess, who had furnished the firm with a pair of monogrammed gloves, a mother's testament inscribed in the late Duchess's own hand, and a parish register from Kent, and whose claim the firm found, on examination, to be beyond any doubt whatsoever. Lady Sefton read the letter twice in the morning room of her own house, and set it down, and looked out of the window for a long while, and rang for no one, and said nothing, and the matter went forward without her, which was its own kind of answer. The portion was paid. The small property in Kent passed to its rightful owner, and the lady in Puce, who had been so sure that the lost girl was a dying woman's fancy and the money better folded home, was not punished, and was not humiliated, and was simply, quietly set to one side of a story that had stopped being about her, which for a person who had spent her life making sure that every story was about her, was the heaviest thing that could have happened, and she felt the weight of it, and was silent. Cassandra Vane taught Latin to 3 young ladies in York for 11 weeks. She was, by every account, the best governess the banker's daughters ever had, and the most exacting and the kindest, and the eldest of the 3 wept when she left, which she did at the end of the 11 weeks, not because she was dismissed, but because she had become, in the eyes of the law and the world, a woman of independent means, the holder of a sealed portion and a small good house in Kent, a paid-up freehold with a walled garden and a study that got the morning light, owing no living soul a penny or a thank you. She moved into it in the spring. She mended the latch on the gate herself. She put her mother's testament and the Duchess's gloves on the mantel where the morning light would reach them, and stood in the doorway of her own study, in her own house on her own feet, a woman the world had twice turned out of warm rooms, who had walked into the warmest room of all by her own road. And she breathed out, and she was content, and she owed nobody anything, and it was the finest feeling she had ever known, and very nearly enough. He came in May. She was in the walled garden with earth on her hands when she heard the gate, the latch she had mended herself, the click of it she knew. And she turned, and the Duke of Aldermere was standing in the gateway of her own small house in his plain dark riding coat, the same coat from the tap-room, no crest, no courier, no chaise, no aunt, a man come alone, a long way on a tired horse, the way a man of business might come, the way the man she had first taken him for might come. He took off his hat. He turned the brim in his hands once, the way a far less assured man might, and he looked at her across the little garden the way he had looked at her, across the trestle in the firelight, as though she were a true thing in a world of performed ones. "You said," he began, and stopped, and started again. "You said that when you were a woman owing no living soul, I might come and say the thing I did not say. To your equal, not to a rescue." He turned the hat. "I have come a great way to find out whether I have left it too long. You owe no one anything. You have your own house and your own name and your own 4 shillings, and I have nothing to give you that you have not got yourself, which is exactly as you said it must be. And I find I have never in my life wanted to give anyone anything as much as I want to give you nothing at all, and stand beside you, and be given nothing back, except the one thing you cannot leave behind in a will or earn at a banker's house, and that I have wanted from the first hour in the tap-room, and have come all this way, as your equal and not your rescuer, to ask you for." He stopped. His voice had gone at the last, not quite steady. "I have made rather a hash of that. I had it better in my head. I left it, I think, in the wagon." And Cassandra Vane, with the earth of her own garden on her hands, and the Duchess's gloves on her own mantle, and the sun coming over her own wall, found that she was laughing, and that her eyes were wet both at once. And she crossed the little garden to him, her own ground, every inch of it, walked on her own feet. And she put her bare, earth-warm hand into his, the right one, where the small scar of the mended seam would have been had she been wearing the glove. And she said, "You have not left it too long. You have come exactly when I could let you. Say it then. Say it to your equal." So he said it. And it was, in the end, a very plain thing, said plainly, by a man who had spent his whole life being told smooth, untrue things, and had crossed half of England to say one true, plain one to the only person who had ever wanted nothing from him. And she answered it as plainly, her own woman, owing no soul, choosing freely in the spring light of her own garden. And there was no marble hall and no crested chaise and no audience and no rescue in any of it, only 2 people who had each, by a different hard road, come to be no one's debtor and no one's charity, standing in a walled garden with the latch she had mended clicking shut behind them. And that, she would tell the children of it years on when they asked, that was the whole of the secret, and the only warmth worth crossing a flood for, not to be lifted but to be met, not rescued, but found. If you have come this far with Cassandra, if you felt that long upright night on the cold bench, the warm room given up by a stranger's hand, the glove with the 3 small letters she had never thought to read, then sit a moment longer before you go, and tell me something true in the comments, the way she would, who in your own life turned out to be nothing like the person you first decided they were. The man of business who was a duke, the cold room that became a home, the small worn thing that turned out to hold your whole history. I read every one, and they are the reason this fireside has a chair kept warm for you. And if you would like another story of a quiet person, the world was certain it had measured and weighed and found wanting, a woman, a winter, a worth that nobody saw coming, the next one is already laid by the fire, and I think you will want to know how it ends.